August 21st, 1942. Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. The jungle breathed in silence before the storm. Beneath a moon of pale steel, hundreds of Japanese soldiers crept through the palms, certain the Americans were trapped ahead of them. They didn't know that across the dark river, US Marines were already dug in, machine guns loaded, mortars sighted, fingers tightening on cold triggers. Within hours, the jungle would glow red, and 3,200 Japanese soldiers would vanish before sunrise. The island had gone eerily quiet after dusk. Even the frogs had stopped. In the muggy darkness, men from the 1st Marine Division lay prone in shallow foxholes behind the low sandbar of the River. The Marines called it the Tenaru. Their rifles were slick with humidity, their nerves sharp as wire. Captain Charles Brush, commanding B Company, shifted his helmet and stared across the water. Somewhere out there, past the tree line, the enemy was massing. He could feel it, the way the air felt thicker, heavier, the stillness before something enormous breaks. He turned to his radio operator. "Tell the mortars to stand by," he said quietly. "They'll be here before dawn." The Japanese had landed days earlier, about 1,500 men under Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki, an officer who'd once been considered one of Japan's brightest. He was confident, ruthless, and proud. Tokyo had told him the Americans on Guadalcanal were few, starving, and retreating. He believed it. He saw the seizure of the island's new airfield, Henderson Field, as an easy victory. "We will crush them in one night," Ichiki had told his officers. "There is no need to dig in. The Americans are already broken." They weren't. On the other side of the river, the Marines had spent days preparing. Barbed wire tangled the riverbank. Mortar teams had their firing grids chalked into the dirt. Machine gun crews lay waiting, the cold metal of the Brownings against their arms. A young Marine named Private Al Schmid checked the water-cooled .30 caliber beside him for the 10th time that hour. His partner, Private Johnny Rivers, grinned nervously in the dark. "You think they'll really come tonight?" Schmid didn't answer. He just stared into the blackness. The first faint sound came around 1 in the morning, boots scraping stone, muffled voices, the creak of gear. Then a single flare went up from the Japanese side, burning a sickly white against the clouds. Brush's voice came over the radio. "Hold until they cross." Moments later, a chorus of screams shattered the silence. "Banzai! Banzai! Banzai!" Hundreds of men surged out from the jungle, charging straight into the shallow mouth of the Tenaru. Bayonets glinted like teeth in the moonlight. For an instant, it looked like a tidal wave of shadows. Then the Marines opened fire. The entire line erupted, Brownings hammering, rifles cracking, mortars thumping. The air turned solid with lead and sand. Tracers ripped through the night in bright red lines, cutting across the water like a net of fire. Schmid's gun jammed, then coughed back to life. He swept the barrel across the sandbar, mowing down men as they stumbled and fell. Rivers fed him belts of ammunition until a bullet caught him in the neck. He slumped forward without a sound. Schmid didn't stop. Japanese soldiers threw themselves into the surf, trying to crawl beneath the gunfire. Some reached the marine wire and were torn apart by grenades. Others tried to swim the river and drowned, their packs dragging them under. Brush watched from behind his line, calm and cold. "Mortars, shift right 20, keep them in the river," he ordered. Every explosion sent sprays of sand and blood into the air. Bodies began to pile against the current, the water running dark. The Japanese believed the Americans were retreating. They had no idea they were walking into a killing field. By 3 a.m., the first wave was gone. Silence returned, broken only by the hiss of steam from the overheated Brownings. Then the Marines heard it again, boots, voices, shouting. Another wave. Colonel Ichiki had refused to believe his men were being slaughtered. "Push forward," he ordered. "The enemy is weak." The jungle answered with gunfire. By dawn, the Tenaru River was clogged with bodies. The Japanese had been so confident they didn't bring stretchers, only swords. The Marines brought shovels. Brush walked the line as the sky began to lighten. He passed rows of Marines slumped in exhaustion, some reloading, others staring blankly at the carnage across the sand. The smell of burned powder and blood hung heavy in the air. The Americans hadn't been surrounded. They'd been waiting. The morning sun rose over Guadalcanal like a pale flame through smoke. The lagoon shimmered silver in the distance, but the Tenaru River ran black, thick with oil, blood, and drifting bodies. The Marines had held the line through the night, but none of them spoke of victory yet. They knew it wasn't over. From his shallow command post, Captain Charles Brush scanned the opposite bank through his binoculars. The mangrove trees beyond the river looked peaceful, deceptively still. But beneath that calm, Japanese soldiers were regrouping. He could see the faint movements in the underbrush, flashes of helmets, glints of bayonets. "Sir," his radio man said quietly, "they're forming up again." Brush lowered the glasses and exhaled. "Then they haven't learned," he muttered. He called for artillery support. A few minutes later, the rhythmic thump of 81mm mortars echoed down the line. Explosions tore through the tree line, sending dirt and palms skyward. Screams followed, distant and fading into the hum of insects. But the Japanese kept coming. By 7 a.m., another assault wave formed, this time more cautious, crawling through the brush, firing in short bursts. Ichiki's officers shouted for their men to charge again, but hesitation had begun to spread. The weak Americans had fought like machines through the night. The Japanese troops were confused. They'd been told the Marines were starving, demoralized, easy prey. Yet here they were, disciplined and merciless, cutting down every advance. Across the line, the Marines rotated gunners and wiped down the overheated barrels. The air shimmered from the heat rising off the weapons. Men's eyes were red from exhaustion, their throats raw from smoke and cordite, but no one dared relax. Brush raised his hand. "Let them cross," he ordered. Through the binoculars, he watched as small groups of Japanese soldiers crawled out onto the sandbar, dragging machine guns and light mortars with them. A few waded into the shallow water, rifles held high, trying to ford the river. The Marines waited. When the leading squads reached midstream, Brush dropped his hand. "Open fire!" The jungle exploded again, tracers stitched across the river like burning ropes. Japanese soldiers fell in heaps, some tumbling back into the water, others collapsing forward into the mud. The few who made it to the far bank were finished by grenades and rifle fire. In the centre of the line, Sergeant Al Schmid was still on his gun. His arms ached, his ears rang. His loader was gone, his position littered with spent brass. Every pull of the trigger sent a jolt through his bruised shoulder, but he kept firing. He didn't even notice when the barrel glowed dull red. One Japanese officer, a captain by his insignia, tried to rally his men. Standing tall in the open, he shouted orders, waving his sword. For a moment, the men hesitated, almost believing him. Then a single shot cracked from somewhere down the line. The officer dropped instantly, his sword flashing once in the sun before disappearing into the surf. The fight began to collapse. By mid-morning, Brush's forward observers reported the Japanese were falling back into the jungle. Marines peered through the smoke and saw figures running, hundreds of them, carrying wounded or abandoning weapons. "Are we pursuing?" asked Lieutenant Jacobs, brushing dirt from his uniform. Brush shook his head. "Not yet. They'll regroup, and when they do, we'll finish it." He wasn't wrong. On the far side of the Tenaru, Colonel Ichiki stood among the wreckage of his men. The stench of blood and salt filled the air. Around him, broken bodies lay scattered, men he had promised victory to just hours ago. His radio was dead, his officers missing or wounded. Still, his pride refused to yield. "We will attack again," he told his adjutant. "This time we crush them completely." The adjutant looked at the corpses choking the river and said nothing. Ichiki drew his sword and pointed toward the smoke rising from the marine perimeter. "We advance at noon." Back across the river, Brush heard it first. The faint rhythmic drums of boots, hundreds of them. "They're coming again," he said quietly. The Marines reloaded. Mortars were reset. The line tensed one more time. The Americans weren't the ones surrounded. They were the wall that the Japanese would break against. The air above the Tenaru shimmered with heat and the stink of death. By noon, the bodies of the first two assaults had begun to bloat in the tropical sun, floating like swollen logs against the current. The smell rolled through the marine lines, thick and nauseating, but no one moved. Every man was watching the tree line, waiting for the next move. They didn't wait long. At 12:30 p.m., the jungle erupted again. Mortar shells from the Japanese side crashed into the sand, sending geysers of dirt and water high into the air. Palm leaves spun down like green ash. From behind that barrage, Colonel Ichiki's remaining men surged forward, screaming, desperate, still believing in their colonel's impossible promise of victory. "Here they come!" someone shouted down the marine line. The Americans answered with everything they had. Mortars, rifles, and heavy Brownings lit up the shoreline. The new Japanese wave splintered almost immediately, bodies tumbling into the river before they even reached the middle. But some kept coming, crawling across the sandbar, trying to flank the marine positions from the shallows. Sergeant Al Schmid reloaded his gun for what felt like the 100th time. His position was half submerged now, the heat from his gun turning the river water around it to steam. Two new Marines crawled up to feed him ammo belts, their faces coated in mud and sweat. "Keep that barrel cool," one yelled. "I'll keep it hot," Schmid snapped back, eyes locked on the sights. He squeezed the trigger. Another line of tracers swept the sandbar, cutting down a dozen men in seconds. The sound was deafening, a constant roar, the Brownings spitting fire as empty casings poured down around him. Farther down the line, Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Pollock, commander of 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, moved among his men. He barked orders between bursts of machine gun fire, his voice low but steady. "Hold this line. No one crosses that river." The Marines obeyed with a grim rhythm. Fire, reload, shout coordinates, repeat. The jungle on the far bank burned now, lit by dozens of fires started by tracer rounds and exploding grenades. At 1:15 p.m., Brush radioed headquarters. "Enemy continues frontal assaults, heavy casualties, request permission to counterattack." A crackling pause. Then the answer came, "Permission granted. Push them into the sea." Brush looked over the river, the water now a crimson reflection of the sky. "Tell the tanks to move up." From the tree line behind the marine lines, two M3 Stuart light tanks clanked forward. Small, fast, their turrets already swinging toward the Japanese positions. Their treads churned through the sand, the ground trembling beneath them. Marines cheered as the 37mm guns opened up, shells detonating among the shattered palms across the river. The effect was instant. Japanese formations broke apart completely. Some soldiers threw down their rifles and tried to swim back to sea. Others crawled into the brush, hiding among the bodies of their fallen comrades. But there was nowhere left to go. The Marines were advancing. Brush's men crossed the Tenaru carefully, stepping over corpses and discarded weapons. The air buzzed with flies and smoke. On the far bank, the jungle was a graveyard. Dozens of Japanese soldiers lay twisted where they had fallen, their uniforms blackened by explosions. Still, scattered gunfire crackled through the brush, pockets of resistance refusing to die quietly. The Marines answered with grenades and bayonets, moving methodically through the undergrowth. One Marine platoon came across a machine gun nest manned by 3 Japanese soldiers still firing. A tank rolled up, its gun depressed almost level. One shell vaporized the position. By late afternoon, the battle had turned into a hunt. Everywhere they looked, the Marines found signs of the desperate retreat: rifles abandoned in the mud, broken helmets, blood trails leading deeper into the trees. Some of the Japanese had tied grenades to themselves and waited silently for the Americans to get close. Others lay feigning death until a Marine patrol passed, then lunged out with bayonets. Brush's men answered with brutal efficiency. There was no mercy left on either side. As the sun began to sink behind the palms, the last pockets of resistance collapsed. Colonel Ichiki's command group, surrounded and cut off, fought to the last man. Ichiki himself sat beneath a burned palm, the sword he'd carried across China resting on his knees. Around him lay his officers, the remnants of a regiment that had once believed it was invincible. He looked toward the smoke rising from the river, toward the faint rumble of American tanks closing in, and realized what he had done. He had not surrounded the Americans. He had led his men into a slaughter. A single gunshot echoed through the trees. When the Marines reached his position minutes later, they found Ichiki dead by his own hand, a pistol at his side, his flag draped over his chest. The Tenaru River ran silent once more. Brush radioed headquarters one final time. Enemy annihilated. Over 3,000 dead. No prisoners. He dropped the handset, staring out at the dark water. For the first time in 24 hours, there was no sound of gunfire, only the quiet hum of the island, as if the jungle itself was exhaling after holding its breath all night. The Marines had held their ground, but what they'd seen would stay with them forever. By dawn on August 22nd, the Tenaru was no longer a river. It was a grave. The current barely moved beneath the weight of hundreds of bodies, Japanese uniforms torn and drifting like seaweed, rifles tangled in roots, helmets floating like dark coins in the water. The smell hit first: blood, mud, and something sweet and rotten that clung to the air. Even hardened men gagged when the wind shifted. Captain Charles Brush walked the bank with his men, eyes hollow from the sleepless night. The morning light revealed what darkness had hidden: the full scale of the destruction. Hundreds of Japanese lay piled in heaps where the machine guns had caught them. Others were half buried in the sand, faces pale, hands still clutching bayonets. Private Al Schmid sat beside his machine gun, silent. The weapon's barrel was warped from heat, the water jacket cracked. Around him, spent casings gleamed in the sunlight like brass shells from some other world. His loader, Johnny Rivers, still lay nearby, covered with a poncho. Schmid hadn't moved him yet. He just stared out at the river, blinking through the sting of cordite and salt. A medic passed by, muttering under his breath, "Christ almighty!" For the first time since the Marines had landed on Guadalcanal, the men understood what kind of war this was going to be. The Japanese hadn't come to fight and retreat. They'd come to die. Later that morning, Lieutenant Colonel Pollock ordered a full sweep eastward. He wanted confirmation that no survivors had escaped to regroup. What they found would haunt them. Through the coconut groves and mangroves east of the river, the Marines discovered scattered groups of Japanese soldiers, some still alive, too weak to move. Others had gathered in small circles, their bodies arranged neatly, grenades clutched to their chests. They had chosen suicide over surrender. In one clearing, they found a group of wounded Japanese surrounded by a small fire. One man raised a pistol to his head as the Marines approached. The shot echoed once, then silence. No one spoke. Brush radioed back to headquarters. "Enemy completely destroyed. No organized resistance. Minimal survivors." The numbers were staggering. Of the 3,200 Japanese troops who had advanced on the marine perimeter, fewer than 130 survived, most captured later while wandering through the jungle in shock. The rest were gone, wiped out in less than 12 hours. The Marines buried their dead in a row behind the ridge overlooking Henderson Field. 19 men, less than 24 lives lost in exchange for thousands. Yet no one felt victorious. In the mess area that night, men sat in silence over their rations. The talk was low, voices tired. A few laughed, but the sound was forced. Brush sat apart, writing his report by lantern light. The ink smudged in the humidity, but he didn't stop. When he finished, he looked out toward the dark tree line and whispered to himself, "They thought we were surrounded." The jungle beyond flickered with distant fires, wreckage still smouldering, ammunition cooking off. Somewhere out there, the waves broke gently against the sandbar that had been hell hours earlier. The next day, word of the victory reached the fleet. The Battle of the Tenaru was hailed as the first major American ground victory of the Pacific War. Headlines back home would call it a triumph. Marines repel massive Japanese assault on Guadalcanal. But the men who'd fought there didn't see it that way. They had looked into the eyes of soldiers who'd come to die, not win. They had heard the chants of Banzai echo through the night and seen what those two syllables truly meant. Private Schmid was evacuated weeks later, half blind from the muzzle flashes that had burned his retinas during the fight. He would spend months in the hospital, haunted by the sound of that river, the roar of the guns, the screams fading into silence. When asked later what he remembered most, he said quietly, "The smell. You never forget that smell." Back on Guadalcanal, the surviving Marines fortified their lines and waited for the next attack. Everyone knew it would come. The Japanese Empire didn't retreat. It returned. And the Marines had just shown them what it would cost. That night, as Brush walked the perimeter one last time, he paused by the river. The moonlight glinted off the water, faint and silver again, just as it had before the battle began. For a moment he could almost believe the island was quiet again, that the jungle had forgotten. But deep inside, he knew the truth. The Tenaru would never forget. It would carry the memory of that night, when the Japanese believed they had the Americans surrounded and instead met the full fury of the United States Marine Corps.